All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is remote debugging. An incredibly useful feature. So if you're using Xojo, odds are you're probably creating apps that are being deployed to multiple platforms. In particular, these are going to be desktop apps, could be web apps as well that are in multiple web browsers. But that means you're going to want to test your stuff on all these platforms. You don't want to just develop on one and then, check the little boxes, as easy as that is. Create your builds for the other platforms and then just, ship them or hand them off. You want to actually try it. Now, an awful way to go about doing that would be to install Xojo on each platform, copy your project to each platform, and run and test the project on each platform. That would be pretty darn tedious. You'd have to have multiple installations of Xojo, multiple copies of your project. Then if you need to make changes, you'd have to go to at least a central place to make changes or have all that stuff properly synchronized. That's just yuck. Nobody wants to do that. And unfortunately, other tools, you do have to do something like this. But in the case of Xojo, you can just use the Remote Debugger. So what does the Remote Debugger let you do? Well, it lets you debug, surprisingly, right from within Xojo itself, but on a different computer. So you may be running, and what I'm going to show you here today, but you may be running Xojo itself on a Mac, like I'll be doing, but I can run my app on a different computer. Essentially, I'll be showing you Windows and Linux. And it'll be running in the debugger on the Mac, but the app itself will be running on a copy of Windows. It'll be in a virtual machine or a copy of Linux. And it allows you to test things much more effectively that way, look at your code, do actual real debugging. A lot simpler than the other method. And of course, you could use other physical computers. Personally, I use virtual machines, love virtual machines, talk about them all the time. I have lots and lots of virtual machines. They're very handy for testing like this. A real computer is also, of course, useful. The downsides for that is you need a real computer. It takes up more space, costs more money, that sort of thing. But a real computer does give you, real, exact usage that, one of your customers might run into. A VM, because it's virtualized, may not give the exact same behavior as a real computer. So it's often helpful to test perhaps a little later down the road on an actual computer. But for initial debugging and development and stuff like that, VMs work incredibly well. And the Remote Debugger allows you to go really in any direction you want. You can have Xojo on a Mac and be debugging on Windows. You can have Xojo on Windows and debug the version of the app running on a Mac. You can go from a Mac to Linux. Any of those directions you can work with. I find that starting with the Mac is often easiest, particularly if you're using virtual machines, because a Mac can easily run all three of the operating systems all at once. You can't technically run OS X on a Windows computer. So that gets a little trickier. You'd either need a separate computer or have to do something else to work around that limitation. But with a Mac, it's very easy and convenient to kind of essentially have everything all on the one computer, making it easy to work with, as we'll see here. And you could even do same computer to same computer. I've remote debugged from my Mac to a Mac VM, for example, which is very handy. And you may want to do that to check different versions. My main Mac is up on the current version of El Capitan, but if I wanted to remote debug because there was a problem on an earlier version of OS X, I could set up a VM for that and test that way. So how to use the Remote Debugger? Well, we're going to see actually how we go through this in a moment, but for now I just want to give a high-level overview. You need something called the Remote Debugger Stub. This is included with Xojo in the Extras folder, and there's versions for each of the platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux. And you need to put this stub on the computer that you're testing on, so it's the one that will not have Xojo. There's a desktop version of the debugger and a console version. We're only going to look at the desktop version today. Console version, as you might expect, is a console version of the Remote Debugger. It is not necessarily used for debugging console apps. It is used for running on operating systems that don't actually have a desktop. So it's, if you have a server, essentially, it doesn't have a UI console that you can connect to or a UI interface you can connect to, you can launch the console version of the Remote Debugger to test that way. It has much more limited usefulness than the desktop version, so we'll just look at the desktop version today. And essentially you get that stub over to the computer, probably copying it from your main Xojo installation that you have. And then on the computer you have to open the firewall ports for 44 or 44553. And that has to be, that's pretty much automatic now. I think Windows just prompts you when you run it and says, hey, do you want to open these ports? I think older versions of the operating system, you actually had to go into the firewall software and pick specific ports and tell them to be open. I don't think any of the operating systems really let you do it to that level anymore. But those things have to be enabled so that the Remote Debugger can communicate back with the Xojo IDE. And then back in Xojo, you add the computer that now contains the Remote Debugger stub. And then while you're still in Xojo, rather than just picking the run button to run it on the computer itself, you now go to the submenu Run Remotely and choose the computer you just added. And Xojo will build your app for possibly the different operating system, send the file along the network to the Remote Debugger stub, which will then launch the app on that computer. As I just said. All right, so enough of an overview here. We're going to jump in and take a look. What I'm going to show you today is Mac connecting to a Windows VM to debug an app, and also to a Linux VM to debug an app. All right, so first thing I have here is my Windows 10 VM that is up and running. And you'll see here I've already copied over the Remote Debugger stub to it. It's in the Remote Debugger desktop folder, and it's right here. So I can just double click this to run it. The stub is very simple. It's just a little screen that shows you the settings. And generally you're going to go to Options right away and take a look at the settings. And you're going to want to give your machine a name. I often have lots of different virtual machines set up, so I tend to name them by the operating system that they have. You can actually password protect the connection if you want. I rarely do that. And then you're probably going to want to set the download location for the file that's sent from Xojo over to this computer to be run. So in this case, you can see I set it to the webinar folder I'm working with now. And you'll see that it'll actually create a folder in there and put your app right in it. And then you can tweak the default ports and other connection stuff. But rarely do you really need to change any of that. And then once you have it here, the important things to note are the name and the IP address. You may need those if Xojo isn't able to grab this information across the network. So first, now we'll go back to our Mac and we'll start Xojo. So now Xojo is launching on the Mac. And we're just going to try out the Xojo Notes desktop project here, very simple project, just to run that across the Remote Debugger. So you can see, if I just hit run, it's just going to run on the Mac, as you would expect. That's great. Now if I want to run it remotely, you'll see here in the run menu there's a run remotely option. And right now there's no computers listed here because we haven't added one yet, but you can click setup here. This takes you to the preferences and right to the debugging pane. And you can see remote debug hosts, and there's nothing here right now. So we can press add. And we can see it found our stub that we have running on Windows 10. That's the name that matches the IP address. So I can click on it and click OK here to add it. So now this machine is available. I can close the preferences. And when I go back to the run remote, it's now showing up right here. And you can see there's a keyboard shortcut, Option Command R will run on this machine, this computer that's set up here. And if you got a bunch of them listed here, which you will at least have 2 in a moment, this will be the last one that you used. So Option Command R will always run to the last machine you use. So when I click this now, Xojo will still do its build, it's compiling it, but it'll be compiling it for Windows now, and now you can see it's transmitting it to the Windows computer or virtual machine. And the Remote Debugger stub is receiving the file, and when the file's properly transferred, it will run it. So you can see now it's running it on Windows. And we can, do things like, I should have said it ahead of time, we can set a breakpoint. And the breakpoint is hit back on the Mac side. So I'm doing my debugging and stuff right on OS X, where I might normally be doing that. But the app itself is running on Windows. All really handy. And as you can see, it is incredibly handy to have this in a VM where Windows is essentially running within a window on the computer. I can switch between it very, very easily. Now, if this were a separate computer, I would just, be swiveling my chair over to the other computer and then swiveling back to the Mac computer to look at the debugging results. And then when you quit the app, it takes you back just like you would expect. So as you can see, a tiny, tiny bit of setup is done at the beginning, but then it's incredibly easy to use. You just, essentially you're running it and it's going to do all the work for you. Transfer it over there, run it on the other computer, and you can do your testing and get access to the debugger. Very handy because there are differences in platforms. Often people run into situations with file paths being different. They don't think about that. Maybe on the Mac, file might be in a location that is a little bit different on Windows. Maybe they didn't account for that. This will point that out very quickly. You'll be shown the line where maybe an exception was thrown, and you go, oh yeah, I got to fix that right there. And you can add in the appropriate code so that it works properly on Windows. Now on the Linux side, it's pretty much the same thing. So let's go over here to my Linux VM. And this is Linux Mint, I think 17.3. And the same thing here, I've copied over the remote debugging stub to my Linux computer, and I can just run it. And it looks exactly the same. And same setups, you want to give it a name so you can easily identify it, and a location to download the build and the other settings as well. And just so I can point out, I'm going to go back to Windows real quick here. You can see it created a folder here, the Debug Xojo notes, where it sent over the actual build. So that's why you need to specify that download location. So this is the configuration here for Linux. Let's slide that over a bit. And back in Xojo itself, we also need to add this to our list of debugging hosts. So we can go back to the project menu and conveniently set up remains here, so I can just click it here to get to the setup instead of going to preferences. And I can click add. And the Linux machine is not being picked up automatically, so I have to type that one in. Now the important thing is that these machines all have to be on the same network in order to access them, obviously. So you can see my local networks are using the 10.0 line. And no, I don't have 159 devices sitting out here, though my wife might think I have that many. All right, so we now have Mint listed here. And if I go back to the Run menu again, you'll see there's now 2 items here. The top one, of course, is the default. That will have the keyboard shortcut, and that's the last one we used. And then any number of other ones that you work with can be listed below. And of course, you can go back to the preferences and you can remove any that you don't need. You can rename them, do all that stuff. As if you're like me and you do have lots of virtual machines, it may end up that your list in that run remotely section gets pretty long. You might want to clean it up. And one other thing that can happen over time is, I don't have each of these VMs set up with fixed IP addresses at all. That's not worth the bother to configure, but it does mean that occasionally VMs might get a different IP address after it's updated and rebooted or something like that. The DHCP server might give it a different IP address, which means that it won't be found, because if, say, that Linux VM gets updated and ends up with a .173 IP address, well, this is no longer going to be accurate. So you'd have to check that and correct it, or remove it and add it back if that's the case. And then here I can run that. And you can see it launched it on Linux. Did I leave the breakpoint? Nope. And it all works like you'd expect. And I can see here my initial testing that I would need to add some code to tweak the button heights so that the text doesn't get cut off. And that's pretty much it for desktop remote debugging. You set the stub up on the computer you want to do your testing on. You add it to Xojo, and then you use run remotely to do your build and send it over to that computer so you can test it. Now, I'm often asked by people about the equivalent for web apps. And well, the cool thing about web apps is you don't really have to do much in that case. You don't actually need the remote debugger to technically debug a web app remotely, because a web app is already kind of designed to run remotely, right? It has a server component and it has the front-end component that runs in the web browser. So if I wanted to, say, run Xojo Notes Web on Windows in the Edge browser, I could just come here on the Mac side and run the project and let it launch. And then I just need to go to Windows and point to the IP address of the Mac. Now, the thing that can trick people up is they'll just like copy and paste what they see up here. But this IP address is for localhost, which means the Mac according to the Mac. But that's not, if I type this on Windows, well, that will mean the Windows computer. It won't mean the Mac. So you need the actual IP address of the computer you want to connect to. So that's the trickier thing you got to look up. In the case of the Mac, you can look that up really easy. Go to System Preferences, Network, and it'll tell you right here. So you can see my Mac is 14. So I can go back to Windows, open up Edge, and attempt to type the URL. And you can see it right there. And because it is running on the Mac, I can run it now from Windows. And this is a great way to test it from multiple locations. You can have a bunch of people try and connect to it if you wanted to. Even on a single computer, you could open up different browsers and connect to it that way. Like if I had another browser on the Mac, I could just punch in the localhost URL and run the web app on Safari and say Chrome or whatever. I could have this running everywhere, and it'll all be connecting to Xojo and working through the debugger like it normally would if you were just running it itself on the Mac. So easy peasy for web apps. You don't even actually have to do any real setup. All right, so I promised this would be a short webinar. I don't see a lot of questions. I don't see any questions on the question queue, so let me switch back here. So you saw how to connect to Windows and Linux to do your testing. Pretty straightforward and easy. And to recap my two main points, by far the best way to test on multiple platforms for your desktop apps is to use the Remote Debugger. Don't go the path of trying to install Xojo on all the computers and copying your source code all around and going down that path. Now, there may be situations where that's necessary. I'm not going to say you're never going to not need to do that, or you're never going to need to do that. But you don't want to just do that by default. It's too much work. It's too much effort. Just set up the Remote Debugger, easy as can be. And then VMs. If you're not taking advantage of VMs when you're using a tool like Xojo, well, you should be. Having multiple operating systems that you can connect to and test your software with is incredibly helpful. And it is just super easy. And you can just switch back. I am using right here, you can see, well, maybe you can see if I can bring up the window. I'm using VMware Fusion, which unfortunately may not be getting a lot more updates lately. The VMware folks said they kind of slowed development on this particular product. But I've been using VMware Fusion for many years, and I'm comfortable with it and like it. Works great. There's also Parallels Desktop on Mac that's available. Both of those products you actually have to buy. There's also VirtualBox, which is free, that you don't have to buy. Of course, you may need to purchase licenses for Windows versions, depending on what you happen to have or need. But Linux, of course, freely available. So you can see here I have lots of different Windows versions set up for testing purposes. A couple different versions of Windows 10, the stable one as they call it, and then the insider build one that has all the latest and greatest features. This one right now, my insider build is right now running the insider builds of the anniversary edition. It's supposed to come out in July, I think. And then I keep older versions of Windows around for testing, of course. I even have, as you can see way down at the bottom, a Windows XP VM that I probably haven't started in a while, but it is sitting down there, many, many years old, happily waiting for its chance to be used. And then Linux is awesome because all the distributions are essentially free. So it's a little, if you're kind of an operating system nut, it's a little easy to go kind of crazy and download all kinds of Linux VMs and set them all up, or Linux ISOs, and then install them all in your VMs and start playing around with them, and you end up with a whole heck of a lot of VMs to manage and maintain. I don't necessarily recommend people have this many because it does become a pain if you have one that you haven't fired up in quite a while and you load it up. There could be a lot of software and security updates that it wants to chug through. And it can cause a bit of time for you to go through all of these Windows versions and run all the software updates and everything. As you can see, I have several different flavors of Linux versions that I'm working with. These days I primarily focus on Mint for testing, and I think Ubuntu 15 I've been using more and more. That one's actually working really well and I like it. And you can also have OS 10. Any version of OS 10, 10.7 or later works just fine in a VM. 10.6 I do have here. I don't think this actually runs in the VM. Or maybe that's, actually it says it's the server version. That one might work. I haven't checked that out lately because Xojo hasn't supported that version for a while. But older versions of OS 10 are not technically licensed for usage in a VM. But 10.7 and later work just great in a VM. I can't say great. They'll launch fine. They're a little sluggish. The video drivers, at least in VMware Fusion, are not super fast for OS 10. But everything works fine. It's perfectly suitable for testing. And if you're crazy, you can try and get other things working in here. I, at one point, actually had an Android emulator running here in VMware Fusion, but that thing did not work well at all. And I think there's some other software that even lets you get maybe a Raspberry Pi simulator running in a VM. But I looked into that a little bit, and it seemed like that was not worth the time it took to get running. It was far easier and cheaper to just buy a Raspberry Pi and set that up. All right, so I got a few questions here that we'll get to in a moment. I also want to point out the doc page on remote debugging is at the Dev Center, developer.xojo.com/user-guide, remote-debugging. And remind everyone that the Xojo Developer Conference this year is in Houston, Texas, in the first week of October. The list of sessions has been posted at the site, xojo.com/xdc. The schedule should be coming out very soon, so you want to keep an eye out there. I think we still are in a discount period, so if you are intending to come, you don't want to wait too long to sign up, because you can save money by signing up earlier rather than later. So definitely check out the site. XDC is a great place to get tips on all kinds of things. I'm sure lots of people talk about the remote debugger at XDC. I think it was a code word at one of the conferences one year. For what? I don't remember, but I remember it had something to do with some evening event at one of the conferences. All right, let me just scan over here to my list of questions, which is scrolling. All right. Joe says that remote debugging for desktop apps can also be done over the internet. So to let the customer play with your app while you're debugging. And yes, you just have to be able to talk to the other computer in some manner. So you'll have to have the appropriate ports enabled so that you can get into their network and that sort of stuff. But you can do it over the internet. Obviously, things are going to be a little bit slower depending on types of connections and whatnot. But that can be an option. If you've got a customer that's having, some specific issue that you can't replicate anywhere, maybe only on one of their computers they have, you can possibly work with them to get the stub on that troublesome computer and run the app in debug mode there, and maybe that would help you pinpoint a problem. So that's a handy tip. All right, Stefan asks, what about supporting files that my app would need to execute? Will only the executable get transferred, or supporting files like config or DB files as well? Well, if your files are part of the build automation, so if they're copied into like a resources folder or something like that by build automation, they'll be transferred over as well. If the files are normally just in particular locations that you've put on your main computer and you expect them to be there, then no, they're not going to get transferred over. You'll either have to manually do that ahead of time. Well, that is the option. You'll either manually do that ahead of time, get all the files set up where you want them on your test computer, or switch to using build automation so that that stuff kind of just happens for you automatically. Let's see. Douglas is asking if I can talk a bit more about the console remote debugger. Well, I can talk a bit more about it. I don't really have that set up to demo at this point, but like I mentioned, the console debugger's purpose in life is the same as the regular remote debugger, except that it's for launching on a server where you don't have a desktop. So you only can like SSH in and you have a command line. Well, then you would launch the console remote, you would get the console remote debugger, copy over to that server, launch it from the command line, and it has a bunch of command line parameters that you can specify all the settings that are in the UI window that we just looked at. And then once you've done that, you leave it running, and then it shows up that everything else on the Xojo side is the same. It'll show up as a host that you can add to Xojo and then click run, and it'll send it over. Of course, it doesn't make much sense to send over a desktop app to a server running the console debugger, because the desktop app's not going to run on a server that has no desktop, right? So really, you're going to use it for remote debugging console apps. But if you have access to a server that does have a desktop, you can still use the desktop Remote Debugger to remote debug a console app. All right, Fabian is noting something, thank you, that I wanted to also mention. Microsoft does offer some virtual machines for testing for free. So essentially they're giving you some free VMs containing Windows that you can just grab and download right from their site and set up. I think they're even pre-built for whatever tool you use. And that is such a cool thing that I'm going to switch to Safari and type that into Google. Maybe I want to add VM in there. Oh, no, it came right up here. So this page here, you can pick these VMs with different versions of Windows that have different versions of Internet Explorer. And then you can pick a VM software, VirtualBox or VMware or Parallels. I don't know what Vagrant is. And then you'll get something you can download. And as it says here, they expire after 90 days. These are intended for testing, different versions of Internet Explorer and Edge, but they're full versions of Windows, so they can actually run Xojo apps and test it that way. So it is a great way to get some Windows VMs for, not really any cost. And, if you're not regularly running Windows and you don't care if you have to re-download these or whatever after, 3 months, this could be a great option. All right, Jost asks, could remote debugging be used with the Raspberry Pi? Unfortunately, not just yet. We really want to get remote debugging working on the Raspberry Pi. But if you're familiar with Raspberry Pi and the 64-bit stuff, both of those are using the new LLVM compiler. And as you've noticed with 64-bit apps, those don't work in the debugger just yet. And that's not really a limitation of 64-bit. It's kind of a limitation right now of the LLVM compiler and some of the interfaces we still need to implement and hook up. So that limitation also applies to Raspberry Pi, even though that is 32-bit. So yes, eventually you will also be able to remote debug into the Raspberry Pi, which will be incredibly handy for testing. As right now you have to build your app for ARM Raspberry Pi and then transfer the file over and run it, and you don't really have any debugging tools other than logging in the old school stuff like messages and things. So that'll be coming. Jost notes that I must have a huge hard drive to keep all these VMs. That's probably a good thing to note. Yeah, I do have one hard drive that's, I think it's a couple terabyte, that's dedicated just for VMs. And I also have a second SSD that's smaller. I think it's only like 128 gig SSD that is used for the VMs that I use most often. And I transfer those to the SSD to run. So the two that I ran today, the Windows 10 and the Linux Mint ones, are running off an SSD. And it is amazing the difference that running a VM off an SSD makes. So, but as everyone knows, SSDs in large sizes are very expensive. So it doesn't make sense to get a giant SSD and just keep a bunch of VMs on there that you never use. So I'm going with this two-part approach. And I will start, older VM, if I just need to test something, an older version of Windows 7 or something like that that's not on the SSD, well, I'll start it off the spinning drive. But it's amazing how much slower that is than when it boots off an SSD. All right, Mark is asking if there's another webinar on debugger use in general. There is. We go to the Dev Center here, and we go to resources. All the videos are in the video section here. And I am sure there is a debugger one. in here somewhere. Right here, debugging. And yeah, this webinar covers how to use the debugger. Looks like based on this screenshot, I also talk a bit about remote debugging as well. So you can check out that webinar. Oh, and Fabian has a much shorter URL to get to that VM stuff that I showed here, the Microsoft VM stuff. It is modern.ie. Ah, there you go. That's kind of the homepage of that. So that might be a little easier to remember. Modern.ie. Thank you, Fabian. All right. Whoops, looks like I pressed something there. All right, so just to bring up my final email address here. That's it for questions. As you can see, Remote Debugger, fun thing. Everybody loves talking about the Remote Debugger. Everyone loves using it, so you should be using it too. If you have questions about the Remote Debugger or anything else, you're always welcome to shoot me an email, paul@xojo.com. Thanks everyone for attending today. Have a great day.